After you plant your garden, there are a few really important things that you can do to maximize production. And just because you have already planted your garden does not mean that the planting should be done. Hey there, I'm Audrey Crawford, and I am a California gardener in Zone 9. I teach you the tried and true methods of gardening in our climate and break down complicated gardening advice into simple and actionable steps so that you can take action and grow your best garden yet this season. This is the Audrey's Little Farm Show. So I'm super excited for today's show because it's going to give you some great tips that you can apply to your garden right now in real time. So you are likely starting to see some really great growth from your summer garden plants. I just planted at the end of April, and I'm starting to have some small green tomatoes and some small peppers. I'm also seeing great growth from everything that I directly sowed out in the garden. And what I would like to encourage you to do if you have not planted yet is to get your garden in the ground. You're not too late. You still have plenty of time to plant. So if you have not planted yet, be sure to get your garden planted. But if you have planted, the planting shouldn't stop. The great thing about gardening in Zone 9 is that you can continue to plant all throughout the spring and early summer, even into late summer for a lot of different crops. So the reasons why I like to replant are for a few different reasons. In the beginning of the season, will replant anything that didn't germinate. So at my planting date, I write down all of my varieties that I plant and I write down the planting dates. And then I keep track to make sure that everything is germinating in its recommended time frame. For example, most warm season crops should germinate in about 7 to 10 days. So if 2 weeks goes by and I'm not seeing germination, I right away replant so that those crops can catch up with everything else. I purposely planted them on that specific date because I wanted to have those crops. And if I'm not seeing germination, I just quickly reseed so that the crops are not that far behind everything else. I had to just do this actually with a few different crops. I had a few cucumber varieties that didn't germinate. I had a couple squashes that didn't germinate. But one of the things I actually did a little bit different this year was that in some of the planting areas, instead of planting 2 to 3 seeds per hole, I just planted one. And the reason I did this was because I still have plenty of time to plant for the season, and there's not any point in wasting 3 seeds per hole when they're likely all going to germinate. Sometimes it is nice to have 2 seeds in the one hole, and you can see which plant grows healthier and keep the stronger plant and then cut off the second plant. But there's a few seeds that I bought this year, and the packet only came with about 8 to 10 seeds, which is kind of frustrating because I wish there was more seeds to work with, but they were new varieties that I'm trying out this year, and I didn't want to waste all the seeds in just a few planting holes. So I just started with only 1 seed per hole, and then if they did not germinate, I replanted a couple weeks later. And what I found is that the majority of seeds all germinated, so it worked out just fine. Everything is growing great. But now my second time around, if the seed didn't germinate, I planted 2 seeds per hole so that it doubled the chances of the seeds germinating. So that's a quick tip if you want to kind of save or ration your seeds, is you don't always have to plant 2 to 3 seeds per hole. But anyways, I replanted the crops that didn't germinate that first time around. And what I found was the second time planting, everything germinated even quicker because the weather is warmer, the soil is warmer, and warm season crops really love warm soil to germinate. And so my second time around, things germinated much better. And then the second thing you can do after planting time is to consider the things that you want to have extended harvest from or spaced out harvest. For example, with my winter squashes this year, I just did one plant for about 5 different varieties. I have a butternut, spaghetti, acorn squash, delicata, and a couple others. They're not coming to mind. But anyways, instead of having multiple of each of those plants, on my first planting, I just did one of each. And then probably towards the end of May or maybe early June, I'm going to do one more of each of those crops. And what that's going to do is space out those harvests by about a month. And so if I would have planted everything all at once, I'm going to get loads of winter squash all at once, but I don't want everything all at once. We don't have a great place to store all of the winter squash for a really long time as it is. And so spacing out the harvest by about a month lets us use some of it fresh and then lets us store some away. But then in about a month after that, we're going to get the second harvest to extend the harvest period where we can use some of the squash in between and then store what we have left over for later months, which is a really cool thing about winter squash. It has a longer storage life. And then same with your summer squash. You don't have to plant three summer squash plants on the same day. You could plant one every 3 weeks or one per month because summer squash grows really fast. And then it's a great way to space out those harvests so you're not getting loads of squash all at once, but you're getting a good production for a longer period of time. And what's really great about that is if your first plants that are more mature start to decline or they get overtaken by pests, you can just pull them out because you'll have a younger plant that's maturing. And then my next post-planting tip for you this time of year is to really pay attention to your watering schedule. So when plants are young and just starting to grow, they need more frequent watering and not quite as long. For example, when you're waiting for the seeds to germinate, there's no reason for slowly watering that area for 20 or 30 minutes because the plants haven't even sprouted yet, but they have to have consistent moisture to germinate. However, when plants get big and the roots start growing deep, like your tomato and your pepper plants, as they get much larger later in the season, it's better to water them for a longer period of time, slowly and less frequently. So right now I'm watering everything about 5 to 10 minutes per day. Sometimes I might skip a day if the weather isn't quite too warm and the soil still feels moist. But I'm just watering more frequently and for a shorter period of time. But by midsummer, I am usually watering my garden for about 20 minutes, sometimes up to 30 to 40 minutes, depending on the crop, every other day or every 2 days. Sometimes I can even skip to every third day with my tomato plants. I will just water them for a much longer period of time and less frequently so that it encourages deep root growth. And of course, you have to judge this on your own garden. You have to test the soil moisture before watering and see what works for you. If you find that more frequently watering is necessary for you, then definitely go that route. But if you can do a longer, slower water less frequently, your plants should grow a little bit better. But right now in the beginning of the season, that just isn't possible because your soil needs to stay consistently moist for those seedlings to really take off and of course for the seeds to sprout to begin with. And everything is in the top shallow layer of soil, which dries out the quickest. So there's really no way to do the practice of slow, deep watering in the beginning. It's kind of just a waste of water. You have to water frequently and more often right in the beginning. So definitely pay attention to your watering schedule this time of year. My next tip for you after planting your garden is to keep really good records and continue doing this all throughout the season. I have a gardening planner that I'll link to in the show notes, but it will give you a really good starting point of all the things that I like to track. For example, planting dates, expected harvest dates, when things germinated, which varieties were your favorite, the entire layout of your garden so that you can remember where things were planted to practice crop rotation, all kinds of things. So I have that all in the gardening planner that I've created. It'll be linked in the show notes. However, just in whether it's a notebook or just a piece of paper, if you can keep gardening records each season, your garden is going to get better and better because no one can tell you what's going to do well in your garden except for yourself after testing it. Just because something grows well for me does not mean it's going to grow good for you. Gardeners have different soil. They have different pest problems. They have a different variety of plants around their garden that may impact how things grow. So you really have to test things for yourself and keep your own records to know what's going to do good for you. Of course, I think everyone should have a good starting point, which is why it's good to get advice from other gardeners and read books and gardening guides and follow, recommended planting dates, etc. But you really just have to test things out and then keep your own records, which is how you really grow and improve your gardening skills. So right now, what I'm keeping track of is my planting dates. I recorded when I planted everything. I'm recording the days that things are germinating. And then I'm also keeping track of which plants are growing better than others so that I know which varieties are performing better in my own garden. For example, this year, I planted 3 different types of beans. I did bush contender beans, cowpeas, and yard-long pole beans. And my yard-long pole beans are totally outperforming the other ones. And there could be a couple different reasons why. I have the yard-long pole beans in a different area of my garden, just planted directly out in the garden along a big cattle panel arch that we built this year for the garden. And so the soil is different. And I have the other beans planted in my raised beds, which is a little bit different soil. It's more, has a little bit of topsoil, but it has more outside soil brought in from, the nursery. And we initially brought in a large truckload of topsoil and compost when we first built the raised bed. So it's just different than our native in-ground soil. So that could be part of the reason why. I'm really not sure. And it could just be the variety. But all I know is that the yard-long pole beans are killing it compared to the others. They were planted after, they germinated faster, and they're about twice the size of the other beans, even though they were planted later. And so that's just a note that I'm taking because I want to know that bean performs really well in my garden. But of course, things can change from season to season. So just because it did really well this year doesn't mean it's going to do the same next year. But that's where note keeping comes in, because next year, if it does the same thing, I could probably mark that variety as a tried and true method that grows well for us here in our garden. But of course, you also want to test out the flavor of things and which, crops taste best to you. And that doesn't happen until those crops start getting ripe and you harvest and cook with them. So keep that in mind. Just because something grows well doesn't mean you're going to like the taste and flavor. So always keep that in mind as you go forward with planting, because you want to make sure you're growing things that you like best and that you'll use. So I hope this gave you some tips that you can apply to your garden right now. Just remember, you can reseed often, reseed anything that didn't grow the first time, continue changing up your watering schedule as needed. As crops get more mature, you can space out the watering just a little bit more. You can water a little bit slow or a little bit deeper and infrequently versus more frequently. And then keep track of everything that you possibly can that's going to help you in a future gardening season. And if you would like real-time help throughout the entire gardening season, I would love for you to join the Zone 9 Garden Club. We just put up our May garden tour and teaching. I go over tips for planting all of the various crops. I give you a walkthrough tour of my garden, and I give you monthly planting calendars. It's just a really great way to help you stay on track for the entire season. Plus, you get to connect with an amazing community of other gardeners. We have over 200 members in there, and we just have such a wonderful community, and I would love for you to be a part of that. So if you head to the show notes, you can find the link to join. And I would really appreciate if you could rate and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Leave a comment. Let me know if there's anything you would like to hear in a future episode. I love hearing new ideas. And most of all, I just love helping you improve your gardening skills so that you can have a more successful garden season after season. So I will talk to you later. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next episode.